Good afternoon. I'm Anely Mendoza. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second plenary for the Independent Learning Association Conference 2021. Before we begin, let me quickly remind you the way that the activity will unfold. This keynote is programmed to be 45 minutes, and we will have 15 minutes for questions and answers. We cordially invite you to type your questions and comments on the Q&A chat box. Our second keynote speaker is Professor Mynard from Kanda University of International Studies in Japan. And the title of this plenary is Outside Class Language Learning Environments. How can we help learners to thrive? Mynard is a professor, director of the Self-Access Learning Center, and director of the Research Institute for Learner Autonomy Education at Kanda University of International Studies in Japan. She has a Master of Philosophy in Applied Linguistics from Trinity College, University of Dublin in Ireland, and Doctor of Education in TEL from the University of Exeter in United Kingdom at CUIS. She has co-edited and co-authored several books on learner autonomy and advising, and has published over 100 scholarly works. She's one of the founding editors of Students in Self-Access Learning Journal and the Journal for the Psychology of Language Learning. Professor Mynard, thank you very much for being here. You are most welcome. And without further ado, I shall give you the floor. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Anely, and thank you to Adelia and all the organizers of the conference. I'm absolutely thrilled and so honored to be invited to speak at the conference. I'm a little nervous, but we'll be okay. And really a little bit disappointed as well. So this will be my third canceled trip to Mexico, because of unforeseen events. So one day I will get back to Mexico. But in my mind's eye today, I'm in Mexico, and I'm imagining that I'm at UNAM, and I can see faces of friendly people and friends from Mexico and from other places in the world. So maybe join me in imagining that we're actually there in person. Okay, so let me just share my slides and get ready to present. Okay, you should be able to see them. Let me know if you can't. All right, so as Anely mentioned, the title of my talk is Outside Class Language Learning Environments and How Can We Help Learners to Thrive? Okay, so let me give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So first, we're going to look at what we mean by outside class learning environments. I mean, I think anyone who knows me will know I'm going to talk about self-access, but it could apply to other areas as well. And then we're going to take a look at self-determination theory. A lot of research in the past has taken different theoretical stances, and I'm adding to our knowledge, I suppose, or hoping to expand perhaps or change, have an alternative way to look at self-access through the lens of self-determination theory. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about a research project that we did, but I'm actually not going to focus much on the research, mostly on how we can apply it to our practice. And then some practical tips if you're interested in taking an SDT or self-determination theory perspective when looking at your self-access center or any learning space, actually. Okay, does that sound good? So as I mentioned, outside class learning environments, they could be any kind of environment really, but mostly I'm looking at self-access. Just a moment, I can't see the slides. Okay, let me just try that again. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. Can you see my slides now? Can someone send me a quick message? Okay, let me just stop it and try it again. Hold on. Just go back to the first one. Okay. That one all right? Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
At least I noticed within the first few minutes, not halfway through my presentation, so that's good. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm going to just skip through. So that was the overview, the 4 points I'm going to be talking about. And we're talking about self-access, but really I'm talking about any environment where we're supporting learners. And we're supporting them in developing their language learning, but also in learning about the process of learning how to learn as well. Okay. Right, so this is Kanda University where I work, and this is the Self-Access Learning Center. And so, when we think of our centers, they're very complex places with so much going on. Even the small centers, if you scratch the surface, there are so many things to investigate. So self-determination theory might help us to do that. Okay. So here are some common things that you might see in a self-access center. I'm sure you recognize many of these. So usually there are places for people to study, to work together. There are materials such as books, advising services, and maybe leaflets, brochures, support with how to learn, maybe worksheets, and opportunities to work with other students is really important. Others as well, but these are probably some key features that you will recognize. Okay, and here's a definition that actually I presented when I last came to Mexico, which was in 2016. And so I defined self-access centers as person-centered social learning environments that actively promote language learner autonomy, both within and outside the space. So I still believe that this is a good definition of self-access learning. So we're focusing on both language and on the promotion of autonomy. Okay. And you've heard me talk about this before, I'm sure, so I'm not going to take very long, but just to give a quick recap, because I think it's important to help us understand our story and how far we've come in the field. So as you know, self-access has been around for about 50 years, and we've seen several shifts in focus over the decades. And I've given each phase a name, and I'm not saying that we've changed, from one phase to the other, but what's happened is we've incorporated previous phases as we've gone along. So in the 1970s, the focus was on personalized learning, and then the 1980s, we incorporated more communicative learning. And later we started thinking about more project-based learning. And then in the 2000s, many centers were lucky enough to get some technology. So we started embracing computer-assisted learning. And we were looking at how we can use technology for communication. And also there were lots of tailored websites for learners to use as well. So at this point, I would say the trajectory around the world sort of was fairly similar. So we were incorporating different ways of supporting our learners as we learn more about the field and how we can support them. And then around that point, I would say there was a big turning point, because what happened is that many learners then started to have access to their own computers, especially their own mobile devices. So at that point, I would say possibly many self-access centers closed, or if you didn't close, you had to reinvent yourself, because students no longer needed to come and access the materials because they had their own. They didn't have to come to the physical center anymore. So what tends to happen is that self-access spaces started to reinvent themselves as social learning communities. And this incorporated mobile learning as well. Okay, and so this has been going on for a little while. But I would say the current phase, or the most recent phase, is the one that draws on emotions and basic psychological needs and well-being. Okay, and so this is what I'm going to be focusing on today. What we're doing during this phase. And so if you look at all the journey we've been through, it's quite amazing that now our SALCs have become hugely complex, interesting, supportive, dynamic spaces. So any of us who are lucky enough to work in self-access, will have experienced many of these things. And we have to be kind of ready to change, adapt, and notice how learners are using the space in order to keep current and to keep supporting them. Okay, so just to summarize. So the two most recent phases then, the 2010s, the social and mobile learning. So I'm sure many centers have some kind of conversation lounge, and you can see in the picture, students have brought their own devices here. So I think this is a fairly common seen in as many self-access centers these days. And then the current scene I'm talking about here is the emotions, basic psychological needs, and well-being phase. So we were on track when I first started researching this, 2018, 2019, we were certainly on track to move into this phase, because a lot of us are concerned with student well-being and supporting learners' psychological needs as well as language learning needs. And then the pandemic happened, and I would say that this has accelerated. So the need to support well-being has been enhanced recently. So let's have a look at self-determination theory as a way of understanding how we can do this, I think. So just really briefly, self-determination theory is a meta theory of motivation and wellness. So it's comprised of 6 mini theories, and it's concerned with understanding how humans can grow and thrive in different life domains, from education to the workplace to sports, the home, and so on. So a lot of this has been influenced by DC and Ryan's work, going back to the mid-1980s, actually. And despite this fact that this theory has been applied widely, and there are decades of robust research studies on which to draw, it has, to my knowledge, not yet really been extensively applied to self-access. So I'll barely scratch the surface today of the possibilities, but maybe we can think about what potential it has for us. So we're focusing on what makes human beings thrive, basically. Okay, and so we can look at basic psychological needs, which is one of the main mini theories. So basic psychological needs theory proposes that humans have 3 basic needs that have to be present if we are to thrive and grow in any kind of activity, if it's language learning or if it's performing in the workplace or staying fit. And these 3 basic needs are autonomy. And I know we think we know what this means, and we do, of course we do. But I'm making the distinction here that it's not autonomy in the same way we think of language learner autonomy. In self-determination theory, it means something slightly different. So from a self-determination theory perspective, autonomy is a sense of agency over one's choices. It's kind of inner endorsement of a person's thoughts, goals, feelings, and behaviors, okay? And then there's competence. And this is the need to interact effectively in your environment. So it means that you feel optimally challenged and you're able to develop a degree of mastery and feel confident as well. And then finally, there's relatedness. And this is a sense of being connected to others, sense of belonging, mutual respect, and even warmth. And you can imagine how these apply to self-access centers. I mean, there's a group of learners in my center at Kanda University, and I like to think that they are experiencing these, or satisfying these 3 basic psychological needs with what they're doing today in this picture. But let's go back to the classroom first. And there's 2 reasons for starting in the classroom. And I think my slides are slow. Yeah, there you go. Let's go back to the classroom first. So although we're interested in independent or outside class learning environments, there are 2 main reasons for starting in the classroom setting. So the first is that examining self-access from a self-determination theory lens has until now been pretty limited. So we don't have much research to draw on. And so it's useful to learn from research in other areas. And there has been a lot of research done in the classroom and the language classroom. I'm drawing on work particularly by John Marshall Reeve, which has been hugely influential. And the second reason is that generating motivation through perceived autonomy support in one setting, i.e. the classroom, can predict autonomous motivation in another setting, for example, the SALC. Okay, so they are connected, as I think we probably know. Okay, so when we start in the classroom, we probably should look at 3 components of autonomy supportive classroom environments. So these are the motivational style of the teacher and the approaches that they take to promote autonomy. The second, so that's the teaching style. The second is the attention that teachers pay to intrinsic motivation of the learners. And the third is the perceived locus of causality. Okay, so I'll talk about these really briefly. So let's talk about teaching style first. So teaching style has an important role to play in creating an autonomy supportive learning environment. And the teacher motivational style could be described as either controlling or autonomy supporting. In practice, you might see both in one classroom. And you would recognize these behaviors, of course. So what teachers with controlling styles say or do in a classroom is quite different from what autonomy supportive teachers say or do. So autonomy supportive teachers help to vitalize learners' inner motivations, whereas controlling teachers neglect or thwart students' inner motivations. Controlling behaviors include things like shouting, coercing, neglecting, punishing, or making students do things by offering rewards. Whereas autonomy supportive behaviors include creating positive classroom environment, having optimal structure, because everybody needs some structure, and having clear expectations and an enhanced sense of learner control. So I'm sure these are things that we all do, or hope we do. So clearly an autonomy supportive style is preferable. And if we look at meta-analyses of large numbers of studies, you can see that learners who have experienced a highly autonomy supportive learning environment, when compared with control groups of students who haven't received this kind of environment, even if they haven't received particularly negative classroom environments, what we see from the research is autonomy supportive teaching promotes higher levels of classroom functioning, higher motivation, higher need satisfaction, higher well-being, higher academic achievement, and many other benefits. And the researchers come from Chion and Reeve, John Marshall Reeve, and many of his colleagues, and DC and Ryan as well. Okay. So what's this got to do with us? Well, let's look a little bit at perceived locus of causality first. So ideally, classroom-based activities will be intrinsically motivating ones and originate from within the learners themselves. And so we can think about this in terms of perceived locus of causality. So on the one side, external causalities. So they're things like rewards, social expectations, social controls, even tests sometimes might be one way that students perceive their locus of causality. And the other are internal causality. So that means intrinsic motivation or inner motivational resources. Okay. So some language learners find the process inherently motivating and they have an internal perceived locus of causality, whereas others feel pressure or external control or other emotions that result in external perceived locus of causality. This work comes from Davis and Bowles, by the way. And you might have both kinds of learners in your classroom. And so that's why the teacher's role in creating an autonomy supportive classroom environment is very important to try to, address all of these things. And I suppose that what we have to think about in terms of self-access is that this is where it starts. So a student who then uses a self-access center may be one of these kinds or a combination of these. So students who are have an intrinsic perceived locus of causality will be intrinsically motivated by language learning, more likely to seek out opportunities to use a SALC for intrinsic motives. And this is likely to be a more rewarding experience than for learners with an external perceived locus of causality. So for this reason, promoting autonomy in the classroom is really important and crucial for effective intrinsically rewarding SALC use as well. Okay. So this picture shows that, we may have different types of learners coming to us. We have to be aware of that as well. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about the classrooms. But I want to talk about laboratory setting now. No, I haven't changed my job. I'm still working in a self-access center. But as I mentioned, there's not much research in the field of self-access related to self-determination theory. But one area we can look at is other outside classroom learning spaces, and a laboratory setting is one such space. So that's why I'm bringing this in. And so physical learning environments outside the classroom will include labs, but also maybe gyms. Maybe there are other spaces you can think of as well. And the role of the physical environment has on learners' basic psychological needs and their overall learning process has been investigated in these settings. So we're going to draw on one such study where the researchers looked at a chemistry laboratory. The other reason I like this study is because it was a smaller scale qualitative study as well. So often in self-determination theory, the studies tend to be very large and quantitative, whereas this, which is great, I'm not definitely not criticizing that. But this study, I think for us, seemed more manageable because it was a qualitative study and it used methods that we're more used to, because we're used to, trying to uncover student stories and understand the details of individual experiences. So this sort of suited our research approach. And so what the researchers here found that previous assumptions do affect conceptions of learning. So if students have a negative view of the lab or the SALC or wherever else, this is going to affect actual learning. So this is why it's important to make our centres really welcoming, isn't it? And the other one is that the role the environment plays is important. So the research shows that the actual environment can thwart or support learners' psychological needs. So it is important to pay attention to it. Okay, so just briefly, the study in the laboratory setting was done in Finland, and the researchers looked at basically the three basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So we can apply some of these findings to our centres. So in terms of autonomy, the lab that was, if something was interesting or activity was interesting or personally valued, then they tended to relate to personal goals. They would promote autonomy. Signage helped with this, also instructions, explanations and rationales, and tools that help students actually find additional information. So these were seen as important in supporting autonomy. And the researchers said that if a student is not capable of navigating independently in the space without constantly asking for information on the most basic level, this can be harmful, not only for the process of learning, but also for the sense of autonomy experienced by the students. And this, I think, I could relate to as well, because we're in self-access. The reason it's called self-access is because often there isn't a teacher available and the students need to be able to find things for themselves. So we're always concerned with these things as well, aren't we? With the signage and all of the things that help students find what they need and use it. Okay, in terms of competence, the researchers found that students appreciated guidance, feedback, tools and equipment that enhanced the tasks, and they wanted to feel a sense of mastery and progress, just as any language learners would, right? Okay, and in terms of relatedness, this was more of a challenge in a lab setting. I mean, you saw the picture. I don't think, for me, labs don't look that inviting. I guess I'm not a chemist, but the researchers wanted to create not just a workspace, but somewhere where the students could exchange ideas with others. But students perceived them to be spaces for carrying out work, not spaces for informal discussions with peers. It was too formal for them. So this is something for us to think about as well. Are our self-access centres perceived by learners to be places where you just go to do your worksheets and your homework, or are they places for them to meet others? And I think we want to, we would love them to become places where students learn informally from others as well. Okay, so let's turn it to self-access. A SALC has the potential to provide autonomy support to learners, which builds on and develops their autonomous motivation for language learning. So applying a self-determination theory lens to self-access learning is still relatively unknown, but it has, I think, great application. So we have begun doing some research at CUIS, and I'm going to share some of the insights from a study that we did at our university. So this is where we're based. The red dot is Kanda University, and it's just outside Tokyo. It's about 30 minutes by train from Tokyo. And it's a small languages university. So all of the students are focusing on languages or international studies. Everyone is studying English, but many of them are majoring in other languages as well, such as Spanish, Portuguese, Thai, Chinese, and others. There are fewer than 4,000 students at our university, so it's really small. And I understand, students are more or less motivated to learn languages, so it's a fairly unique environment. And our self-access centre occupies this large building. There's also classrooms, a research institute, and offices in there. And so we have many different facets that we wanted to investigate. But the question we have is, how do we know if our self-access centres are places where learners can thrive? Okay. All right, let's have a look how we can go about researching that. So these are our research questions. So the first one is, how autonomy supportive is our SALC from the perspective of different stakeholders? And by autonomy supportive here, I mean that's a catch-all in self-determination theory. It means how do we promote autonomy, competence, and relatedness? So it's all of them. So how autonomy supportive is our SALC? The next one is, what aspects of the SALC require more attention to support students' basic psychological needs? And finally, what actions could be taken in order to improve the autonomy supportive nature of the SALC spaces? So there's sort of, a few parts to this research. And there was a large research team, more than 20 of us. There were learning advisors, teachers, assistant managers, and students conducting the interviews and doing the research. And the first part was really finding out, how autonomy supportive our space is. The second part was deciding what we wanted to do with this information. And then the third part is taking action. Okay, and we're nowhere near finished. We basically have only just really started the first one. It's going to take a long time, I think. So for our initial study, we did 108 structured interviews in our SALC with people in the Self-Access Centre over a 2-week period. So we interviewed people who were just there and were willing to be interviewed on the spot. And so this took part at different times of the day, different spaces, okay, and by different people. Then we collated the results, and we asked them things like, what do you love? What do you like doing in the SALC? How does it make you feel? And things like that. These have been published in a few studies, so you can read more information about this later if you like. I've got a link to the slides that you can have later. We also did a questionnaire that was sent to all of the university students, whether they use the SALC or not. And then we also did structured evaluations of the SALC spaces. So the staff did that, well, the learning advisors. So the people like me who work every day in the SALC, it's our day job. We know the space really well. But we did a kind of very systematic and structured evaluation of key SALC spaces. So we had quite a lot of data. And I'm just going to, skip to the good bit, just skip to the end. What did we find? And really present a very fast summary, but because I want to get on to what we can do with that information that might help other centres. So basically, we have been around for 20 years, and the purpose of our centre is to promote language learner autonomy. We've got a dedicated team of 12 learning advisors and staff who work full time. So we take this very seriously. So perhaps it's not surprising that we found a lot of what we do is largely autonomy supportive. Okay, so that wasn't a surprise, but it was good to see that from a different perspective, from a self-determination theory viewpoint, from a tool from psychology that could be applied to our centre. So that's the first thing we found, which was reassuring. The next is that basically students perceive our spaces to be inviting and welcoming. Okay, also good news. We offer a wide range of resources that cater for different needs and interests and goals, and largely that was appreciated. Okay, but this is where we get into the parts that perhaps we do need to address. When we looked at whether our SALC is competence supportive, we feel that we offer so many things, workshops and classes and materials and all sorts of things. Advising, of course, is the main one. But yet, many of the people who participated in the interviews felt that their need for competence is not being supported. They lacked confidence and felt they weren't being supported sufficiently. So we have a few ideas for why. A lot of it perhaps is cultural, contextual, and psychological, but we definitely need further investigating. And the other one is many students felt a sense of belonging, which was really nice. We have students who come every day and they have their group is there and they definitely look as though they belong. But others feel like outsiders. So that's also something we need to investigate a bit more. And so what we need to look at, we highlighted that there are some psychological barriers to using our centre. And that's something we need to take really seriously in the coming years. So that's really a really quick version of our results, but each centre is going to have different results. So we're going to just draw on some of the things we found that could be more universally applied. Okay. So here we go, back to our learners that I hope are experiencing autonomy, competence, and relatedness here. So the question is then, how to create a more autonomy supportive environment for these students and all of our students. Right, let's take the basic psychological needs one by one then. So this is the way we can promote autonomy. And I mean in a self-determination theory sense. So autonomy here, remember, is a sense of agency, choice, and inner endorsement, right? So the first thing that you need to do, of course, is to provide a lot of choice. So the first choice is whether to use the center at all. The next is if you do decide to come, what you do there, when you come, which sections you use, how do you use it, who do you use it with? And this is probably going to need a little bit of scaffolding and support as well. So choice, really important. And the choice of language as well. I mean, ideally, we want students to have opportunities to use the target language, but they may want to use their L1 as well, or a mixture. So really, this should be personal choice. We're lucky we have a second floor where we can have some target language only spaces, but we certainly wouldn't want that for the whole space, because that would take away the students' agency, wouldn't it? We also want to make sure we have interest-based materials and activities that relate to personal goals that students might have. So not just language learning resources, but things that are of general interest as well. And we really want to promote student leadership, a sense of student ownership. So these kinds of things promote autonomy in the self-determination theory sense in a SALC. And advising, let me mention advising, because this is so important for everything that we do. So the reflective dialogue that students engage in with a learning advisor helps them to realize their inner motivational resources as well. Okay, helps them to use the center and consider what they need it for and how it matches their inner motivations. This is an example of student leadership that many SALCs are embracing. So creating student-led interest-related groups and bringing people together. So in this case, the students organize everything, and the learning advisor might be there to support them, help them reflect on the activities, and help them maybe to advertise and find other learners who are interested. But really, this is something that the students actually come up with and lead. Okay, so let's look at competence. So this is helping students learn how to learn. I think most self-access centers do this quite well already, and help students to set personal goals or targets. So this can be done in advising sessions or in the classroom, indeed, before they come. Provide opportunities for language practice, which could be scaffolded, encouraged, and supported. I think it's not enough just to have a conversation lounge. There needs to be support involved there as well. That students are helped to challenge their beliefs, whatever this might be in your context. So the study highlighted in our case, for instance, many students believed that they weren't able to use the conversation lounge because their English wasn't good enough. But we know as language educators that actually practicing the language in a supportive group, in a highly kind of cooperative environment, will help learners develop the confidence and to use the target language. But this belief remains that I will study first, and when my English is perfect, then I will go to the lounge to practice. So this is a belief that we might want to challenge in an advising session, for instance, help students consider alternatives or see this from a different perspective. Okay, this is just an overview of a course that we teach on self-directed learning. So the course introduces students to different ways that they can manage and understand themselves, manage their learning and understand themselves. So starts with imagining your future, looking at your previous learning experiences, setting goals and so on. And then the second part, they implement a personalized plan. And this is something that is a optional 1-credit course in the classroom or in self-directed format. So something like this is quite useful to have. In many cases, universities or schools embed this into the language program as well. But these are the kind of things that are going to enhance students' competence and sense of control over their managing their language learning. And I know even here in Mexico, there are many good examples of supporting students. So I know this one at the Jesuit University in Guadalajara. You have this lovely supportive conversation club and advising service, which looks so welcoming, even when it's online. So this kind of thing is going to help students develop, support their basic psychological needs of competence. Okay, and then let's just turn last one to relatedness. I think my slides have been a bit slow. Okay, here we go. So relatedness, these are the kinds of things that can increase a sense of belonging, will be events and meetups. I think we know that those of us who work in self-access know this. Often we have to convince our more academic colleagues or colleagues who don't realize that a party or an event is an important step for helping students come into the community, and then they can start to learn. And so, yeah, these are important. Also training conversation partners to be a supportive listener and to create a sense of belonging and support. Props and tools are often very handy here as well. So games and books and things like that that can enhance an environment, feel a sense of belonging. Learning communities like the ones we had a look at just now, the student interest groups, for instance. These are really good enhancing supporting basic psychological needs of relatedness. Okay, so one of the things we really focus on in our SALC is creating communities, and you can look at some research later if you like by a couple of colleagues, Daniel Hooper and Satoko Watkins. And so from their research, they've done several studies where they've joined and observed and interviewed members of these communities that students have created. And what their research has highlighted is that, as we might expect, being a member of the community, especially a community leader, promotes leadership. And what happens is that members tend to develop interdependency and altruism. So in Japan, there might be a hierarchical structure where it comes to clubs, the more senior members will be in charge. But actually what we find in the communities in a self-access center, that it's a lot more equal, and that people are interdependent, no matter whether they're first years or fourth years. They all have a role to play in supporting the group and each other. So the leaders are very good at creating a sense of belonging. Learners tend to develop confidence, and they focus on their interests. So they don't worry so much about their language learning skills, but the main focus is on the sense of belonging. I think creating communities addresses all of the basic psychological needs, but in particular relatedness. And even during the pandemic, our students have been very creative. Here's the Galactic Movie Club, complete with their props that they're using in their lunchtime meetups, and other groups as well, organizing events that happen on Zoom. So they put up their posters, the Zoom links are there, and so anyone is free to join. Okay, that one was a bit slow. Okay. So these just really come up depending on which cohort of students happen to be there and who's been proactive at the time. So they change all the time. Okay, let's go back to basic psychological needs. And this is a model that I have developed that's coming out in a chapter next year. And basically what I've done, I've drawn on research by Davis and John Marshall-Reeve and other researchers in self-determination theory, and put together a suggested model for self-access. And so we've already talked today about autonomy, competence, and relatedness. But what the other researchers tend to do is they draw on what's called inner motivational resources as well. So they're looking at curiosity, intrinsic goals, and interest as well. And so I haven't done research on this, and we haven't collected data. It's purely theoretical at the moment, but I think it has potential. So this is something I'd like to look at over the next few years. So the first one is curiosity. So curiosity here is considered to be an emotion. So this occurs whenever students become aware of an unexpected gap in their knowledge that they wish to close. So, our self-access centers are full of things that could close this gap because of the range of activities and options we can provide. However, the key is to help learners realize, that there is this gap. So it gives them a chance to observe other learners. So, often students see other learners speaking in the target language in their community, for instance. So this is a good option. How do they get to do that? So it inspires a bit of curiosity. Maybe they will see lots of target language resources around them, which will inspire their curiosity. And they want to raise awareness of scenarios as well. Okay. Another one is intrinsic goals. So this is ones that represent opportunities for personally meaningful growth. And so a SALC can offer many opportunities for this. And advising dialogue, I think, would be the most crucial way of helping students uncover these intrinsic goals. So through these reflective dialogues or reflective activities, the tools that can be in the learning, in our learning centres can help students reflect and discover themselves and match their intrinsic goals with what they see around them. And finally, interest. So here, this is defined as a knowledge as well, a knowledge emotion. And there are two kinds of interest we might want to consider. So the first is situational interest. This might be quite fleeting. It might be triggered by novelty or a SALC activity. And it might be temporary though. But it can lead to individual interest, which is long lasting, more enduring. And this helps to sustain longer term learning. And some of the research we've done shows that students who use interest as a motivational resource are more likely to persist in self-directed learning. And we can raise awareness of different things that students can do to perhaps trigger this situational interest. So notes, explanations, recommendations, posters, videos, learning communities, recommendations from other students, and so on. All of these things can help trigger students' interest. So I think this is an area I would like to look at in the future. Okay, I'm going to do a summary so far, catch my breath. So we've looked at outside class learning environments today, mainly self-access centres, and we looked at how we support students in their language learning, but also the process of learning a language. And we've looked at a self-determination theory perspective. So we started with the classroom to see what research tells us about the classroom. We've looked at research in laboratories as an example of an outside classroom setting. And we've looked at some initial research we've done at my university. So all of these things have led to allowing us to apply this research to practice in self-access in some ways. And I think probably what you have done is probably think, oh, we do this, we do this, we do this, which is fantastic. And we did the same thing. But what it helped us realize was how it's situated within a larger psychological theory. So you can say from a self-determination theory perspective, this is how we support learners, which seems a lot more rigorous, I think, rather than we think it works because we've sort of looked at it and we observe it. We can say it works because this is what the research tells us, and this is what we've noticed as well. So the last part, I'm going to look at some practical ideas then, for if you're interested in going further with self-determination theory. Okay, so how can we help learners to thrive? Well, the first step I would say is observe your SALC carefully, systematically from a self-determination theory perspective. So go there with your mindset, okay, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and think about, evaluate key spaces. What are your key spaces? If it's your conversation lounge, start there. If it's your worksheet area or if it's something else, start there, okay? And consider how the space satisfies or doesn't the basic psychological needs, and make lots of notes. And what you'll find, like us and like everywhere, I think, is that some aspects will be very autonomy supportive and others not so much, either neutral or it may even thwart autonomy, but you can start to see it from a different perspective. And then ask your users questions as well. So you could do a large scale study like we did, or you could just ask a few users or other colleagues how they use the space. Make some more notes, summarize your findings. So you should start to have a good idea of how, where you could take this. So the next thing would be to identify priorities with your team. How can key support services be improved? And then take each project one by one. We're very complex in, the nature of our SALCs. So if we just take it one by one and think about how you could improve this area and do a little action research project, and do it one by one. So this makes it really manageable. Okay, and it's a really interesting process to go through. So I challenge you to do it either by yourself or with your team. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. And I just want to finish with a couple of resources. Here are the link to the slides if you want to see it. paste it in the chat in a moment. We have a research institute. So if you're interested in looking at any of the papers we've published or looking at tools or events that we have coming up, you're very welcome to take a look there. We have 2 journals as well. So if you want to read more about self-access, they're both open access journals, or if you want to, if you want to consider publishing in them, we'd love to hear from you as well. But thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for such an inspiring plenary, as always, Dr. Mynard. So I will share with you the questions that the attendants have written on the chat, okay? Okay, the first question was from Perla Tamara Figueroa Lopez, and she asked, how do you deal with the challenge beliefs? I mean, do you use infographics or record videos or have some talks to discuss these kind of topics?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. I'm just posting
Don't worry,
link.
don't worry.
Yeah, okay. I just posted the link to my slides in case you want to refer back to them. Yeah, how do we challenge beliefs? Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel some learners, no matter how much you talk to them and listen to them and help them think, they're not ready. So, you know, it really depends on the learner. Usually, I think the most effective is in an advising session. So if you have a chance to work one-to-one with a student, listening to them and asking them to talk about their experience, often they hear what they're saying out loud. And with this reflective dialogue, you can help them realize there's a gap here. So the most effective, I would say, would be through one-to-one advising, maybe not just the first, maybe after several sessions. Another is we do an activity it could be a workshop where we have different students' beliefs on cards and students discuss them, which one is the best course of action for this student. She wants to improve her English speaking, but she's very shy and she believes this, this, and this. What do you think? Give some advice to this student. So a kind of group work activity like that could work well as well. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, we got another question for Catherine Thornton. She agrees that many learners are lacking of a sense of competence, According to the previous research you mentioned, labs, competence is also related to feedback. How can SALCs provide opportunities for language feedback, especially as ALAs tend to avoid it for good reasons?
That's a good question, isn't it? Yeah. So really often when students, for example, if a student asks, please, could you correct my essay? Or is this, is my grammar correct? As learning advisors, we don't want to take on the tutor role. So we tend to, want to talk about the process of learning. And so but I think if it's not us, then there needs to be somewhere where students can get feedback. I think maybe the ideal way is to have student groups. So it could be a TOEFL group or an exam group or a group where students themselves give feedback to each other, and then they invite a teacher in to join that if they want, the absolute answer. So that's one way, I suppose. Another, I suppose, through our self-access materials, we try to choose things that have answer keys, so students can find their own results. And also, I think it's quite nice to have a tutoring opportunity as well. It could be peer advising, or it could be somewhere where students can go to get feedback. So I think maybe to separate that from the advisor role is probably a good idea as well. Yeah, but often feedback in self-access, often it's about speaking. And so the feedback they receive is whether they can successfully, manage to have a conversation in the target language. And so as a learning advisor, we can have them do a self-evaluation. How do you feel after that? How was my pronunciation? How was, could I say what I wanted to say? How is my fluency? So a kind of self-evaluation, and then try again, and compare. So this time I was able to explain myself well. I felt a high level of confidence and people understood me compared with last time. So maybe helping them to self-evaluate, I think, is something that learning advisors can do. Yeah, thanks for your question. There's probably loads of other things. If you can think of them, feel free to type them in.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, Magdalena Avila said that it was an inspirational talk. So I got a third question for you. You talk about self-determination theory perspective. So I think it's one of the topics of the theories that is talked about a lot. So this can also serve to promote autonomy in the classroom. Thank you.
Sorry, just to make sure I got the question right. So we want me to talk about self-determination theory and how it promotes autonomy in the classroom.
Sure, exactly.
Yeah.
Voice in the classroom.
Yeah, I think, well, most of the research has been done in the classroom, and I've been trying to apply it to self-access. In a way, it can be easier. I mean, another way, it's more difficult. So in one way, you know, the teacher has their learners, you get to know them very well, you know who they are, you can understand their inner motivational, you know, intrinsic motives, and you can tailor classes to support that. You can, I think I showed a chart in my slide you can have a look at later, but things like helping students to feel a sense of ownership as well. And so you don't want to have a classroom that's all very teacher-centered, very top-down, that you incorporate students' ideas as well. And a sense of, I said a sense of ownership, but this could be students choosing how to do certain things, or given students a choice over, which assignments to do. You know, sometimes you don't have a lot of choice because you have a curriculum you have to cover, but within that, maybe there are some choices you can let students make, and individualize it as much as possible. So if they have to write an essay, let the students choose the topic of the essay, for instance. You know, that's a very surface level example, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. So Helen Head said that it was a brilliant and very helpful talk. So getting feedback, could digital tools help with students getting individual feedback for themselves?
Oh, thanks, Helen. Yes, Ellen, sorry. Yeah, that's a good point. Digital tools, probably. Yeah, so some of the software programs, for instance, can give students correct their activities straight away. That's a good idea. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think they could give feedback, but I think what that should be accompanied with is advising.
Okay.
And so rather than, students just getting the computer corrected version, but then have a chance to talk about it with, well, other learners, but advisors as well. Do I agree with it? That could be one. Or was this a good method for me? Did I learn from this? Or is there another way I could get feedback? Yeah, something like that.
Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. There is one more from Claudia. In your research experience, does peer advising can have an impact on autonomy, competence, or relatedness, or in all of them, maybe?
Yeah, I think all of them, definitely. Yeah, so I think if you've got a chance to train your peer advisors in exactly this, that might be useful. So one of my colleagues, Satiko Watkins, is training, actually, she's doing a kind of leadership module. And so the students who take this module go on to become student staff in our self-access center, or peer advisors, or community leaders. And she basically teaches them their basic psychological needs. And so the students start thinking in terms of how autonomy supportive am I? So I think that's, a really amazing example, that it doesn't, even if it's not something as complete as a whole training course on self-determination theory, but a raising awareness of the effect of basic psychological needs, I think is really useful. And Ellen, I saw your question about the materials, the cards about giving advice and beliefs. Yeah, it's published in our book. The book came out last year in Multilingual Matters. It's Dynamics of a Social Learning Space, Identity, Beliefs, and something. But it's one that at the end, the appendices has a lot of activities for challenging beliefs about that. Yeah, and it's in a Japan context, so it could be quite useful, I think, in your case. Sorry, Anneli, I just saw that question and I...
Don't worry. It's okay. It's okay. Okay, I don't know if we got another questions. I mean, we don't. This is one for the, let me.
Oh, I see, Sarah, two good questions. Well, thanks, Sarah. Could competence-related feedback be part of renegotiated goals, make progress in their learning? Oh, yes, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Okay, this is one from Eduardo Diaz. Has any of the students reported if they've applied what they've practiced or learned with other and maybe more personal groups different to those of the SALC or the context of a school, especially in terms of social and collaborative skills?
Oh yeah, definitely. Actually, in the book I just mentioned, it was a 2-year ethnography. So we tracked learners for 2 years to find out how they use the conversation lounge. And some of them said that they stopped using it because they outgrew it. Basically, this community was too constrained. They didn't want to just talk to other students. So after a while, they started finding their other groups outside the university to provide this opportunity for social interaction. So that's exactly what happened. But students tend to start in the SALC and find their, get their confidence with other learners and in a supportive environment, and then they get more courage and join other groups. Yeah, I don't know about the other way around. Perhaps that happens too, but we don't have data on it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mynard. I think that we don't have any questions. So, well, we have reached the end of the conference. So we appreciate all the participants and invite them to the following sessions of our conference. Thank you very much, Dr. Mynard.
Thank you very much for all the questions and the attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.